Welcome back to Basically Related. I'm Lee Benson. Today we are talking about Easter, the foundational event of Christianity. The whole of Christianity hinges on this moment and the truth of the resurrection. Easter and the resurrection also present a good time to talk about symbolism and the centrality of Christ. Before we begin, remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, do all the things. Help me to appease the fickle and pernicious algorithm gods. So as I mentioned, today we're talking about Easter, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the whole of the Easter event, the significance, some of the important images and symbols, and the like. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my philosophy or my idea of approaching this event of Easter, because of course there are many significant natural or cosmic events and acts that act as symbols throughout the resurrection and the narrative itself. And especially if you go to the Easter Vigil, there's a lot of talk of light and darkness, night and day, the sun and the moon, death and resurrection. All of these, again, kind of opposites are at play in the Easter. They're a union of opposites, a union of death and life. And of course, we see these all throughout different religious symbolism and religious motifs. And so there's this perhaps inclination or temptation to make the resurrection like any other event. If you kind of get into looking at mythology or comparative religion and such, you see that the resurrection is sometimes seen as as like any other dying and rising God, which simply isn't true if you look at the content of Christian belief, and especially from the earliest times. It wasn't later on that Christians came along and said, we're going to move away from the mythological understanding of Christ to a more historical. From the very beginning of Christianity, the truth of the resurrection, the historicity, the historical fact of the resurrection was asserted. So when we think about comparative religions, usually it's the idea it's the study of the similarity or dissimilarity between different religious ideas and motifs and myths. But I maintained that Christ is the fulfillment of all religion. This is also a foundational belief of Catholicism, that Christ is the beginning and the fulfillment of all religion. The reason why there are similar religious patterns or religious archetypes is because of Christ. Christ is not one pattern or one archetype among many archetypes, but he is the center and source of those archetypes. The reason why we have them at all, the reason why we can see any coherence or any similarity is because of the unity in Christ that they share. There would be no coherence and no pattern without Christ. There is an original or primordial font of these archetypes. They flow from God the Father through Christ into the world. But it's in Christ that these patterns take shape and are unified. So the truth of archetypes, or the truth of any sort of religious pattern, is ultimately judged by the criterion of Christ. And we can't study any sort of symbolism, I think, without understanding Christ himself. Carl Jung even says that the ultimate origin of archetypes is most likely some metaphysical question or metaphysical source. And as this relates to the resurrection, of course, again, is the idea that Christ is just another pattern of dying and rising, like any other kind of ancient or pagan god. However, what we see, or if we want to kind of begin at the start of these religious ideas, we can look at the earliest practices of religious man or of mankind. Mircea Eliade, the historian of religion, says one of the oldest pieces of evidence we have of religious practice or religious belief is burial. And in his mind, burial confirms a belief in survival after death. That burials are often oriented towards the east. People are buried in fetal positions. They're showing this intention that the fate of the soul is in some ways bound up with the fate of the sun. That the sun rises, runs its course, and then dips under the earth. Of course, symbolically, goes under the earth. The sun goes under the earth and then reappears again. So this idea that the east is where the sun rises, resurrection, and the west is where the sun sets. That's the kind of the realm of darkness in the west, and the east is the realm of light. So that's why these bodies, he believes, were most often oriented towards the east. In fact, in our own Christian churches, that's why we usually try to have the church, or at least historically, have the altar and the priest face the east, the orientation towards the rising sun, towards the resurrection. So for mutuality, again, the earliest practices of religion are burials, signifying that there is a post-existence, that after a person dies, they go on living in some sense, and perhaps they might come back to life. That's why they're kind of adorned, or they're buried with perhaps meals or objects and clothing. All of this to symbolize that man is not simply just flesh and blood, but he has a post-death existence and perhaps might even come back in the future. So one of the readings for the liturgy or the Mass on Easter, it begins with on the first day of the week. So this idea of the day of the sun, Sunday, as we now say, is a somewhat contentious issue in the early church, because the day of the sun is the day of Helios. So the early church kind of combats and wrestles with early paganism and how to distinguish themselves, what good can be taken from paganism and what has to be rejected. And one of the areas where the church struggles is, of course, the cult of the sun, which is well known and was widespread in the ancient world. So the religious longings of man often centered upon the sun as the supreme religious symbol. But Christianity comes along and in some sense rejects the cult of the sun, but in other ways absorbs some of the aspects. It changes and transfigures the sun devotion. So the church believed and had sure knowledge that it had revealed truth in her possession. And yet, at the same time, while knowing the church and early Christians believing they had revelation, they were receptive to every seed of the Logos that the church saw kind of germinating within the kingdom of the Greek and Roman spirit and mind. So the confrontation with these sun cults involves this mixture of rejection and absorption. One of the aspects, of course, that early Christianity rejects is that the sun is a god. From the beginning of Genesis, or at the beginning of Genesis, Christians know that the sun and the moon, the stars, all these things are created things that are subordinated to God. But yet, the idea that there's some connection between the sun and man's life is kind of primordially evident, and it's a primordial experience of man to look at the sun and see his life in the sun. So later on, Christianity comes and says that there is some truth. There is some truth to this idea that Christ, the Son, S-O-N, of God, has this connection to the sun in the sky. And this becomes preeminently obvious, or it's highlighted in the Easter liturgies, that the sun rises and then it dips below the earth. And this sunset is the death of Christ on the cross. And then the sun's journey under the earth, as we understand it spiritually or symbolically, is Christ's descent into Hades and his time in the underworld. But then at the Easter Liturgy, the Son's resurrection again, both S-O-N and S-U-N. And this is, as some scholars say, it's freeing for the religious man to know that his life is not dependent upon the cosmic elements, but in fact now is dependent upon the Logos, the Son of God made flesh. So what we see is primitive Catholic theology did not think it was necessary to completely reject everything that pre-Christian thinkers thought was worthy of honor. For Christianity did not look upon itself as simply another doctrine. Christianity knew it was not another doctrine. It did not look upon itself as just another form of religion. It held itself to be the divine revelation in Christ, and that Christ had taken living form and had embraced all of humanity and all really of the universe into himself. So the fact that there might be some correlation of the cosmic elements with the life of Christ is not surprising. Again, they believe it is in Christ, through Christ, that all of creation comes to be, and that Christ is the reason, as St. Paul says in the letter to the Colossians, that things have coherence in Christ. They have unity in him. So the fact that we see all these cosmic elements somehow related to the life of Christ shouldn't be shocking. This is why the church, with kind of supreme self-assurance, could gather home all these different truths, that all the good things that preceded Christ could be made the church's own, that the church saw truth wherever there was truth that belonged to the church itself, and it could do so without any harm to itself. Of course, again, we can't, the early church did not take the cult of the Son as, wholesale. They didn't just completely adopt it. There were things that had to be rejected or things that had to be defined. But the truth, the essential truth of it was preserved by the church. St. Justin Martyr says that it is in Christ the Logos that humanity and all of creation has a portion, so that even all those who lived according to the truth, according to the Logos, are Christian. Even people like Socrates would be considered Christian because he lived according to the Logos. So the church claims for her own whatever truth is out there, whatever the heathen said rightly and believed correctly, the church could take into her own. But by correcting their errors, by supplying their defects, by completing their beginnings and expanding their ideas, so the church readily sees truth, or wherever there is truth, as a part of its own possession. In many ways, Christianity is a cosmic religion. We can look at the dating of Easter as one of those elements. Easter is determined by a calculation that places it on the first Sunday after the full moon that occurs on or after the spring equinox. If the full moon falls on a Sunday, then Easter is on the next Sunday. So during the equinox, which actually comes from a Latin meaning equal and night, equa, then nox, night, that the Earth and its axis kind of orbit that represents kind of an equal amount of sunlight, that there is in this moment a shifting of the Earth that also corresponds to sunlight. And then you also have this moment of the fullness of the moon, the fullness of time, the fullness of revelation, man at his height. All of these elements, these cosmic elements, are pointing towards this supreme moment in Christianity of the resurrection of God's Son. But again, because all these elements, that all the sun and the moon, the earth, all these elements are subordinated to Christ, we can adopt them without any sort of fear of of adopting paganism, because all these elements, again, point to Christ. They're subjugated to Christ. They exist because of him. The resurrection stands as the basic content of the Christian message from the beginning. It was belief in the Eucharist and belief in the resurrection that defined early Christianity. And this moment of resurrection, again, happens on the day of the sun, on Sunday. And it was a way for Christianity read into these cosmic signs, a distinction between Christianity and Judaism. For the Jews, the Sabbath was on the day of the kind of Roman calendar at that time, the day of Saturn. It was a separate day from the day of the sun, day of Helios. So again, Christianity once steps away or separates itself from Judaism, but then takes on and absorbs this other day by the Romans. And Christians see that Christ rose on the day of the sun as not incidental. It was an act of providence, meaning that Christ had supremely overtaken that sacred day of the pagans. That Christ shows himself as the true rising sun, the true first day of the week, that can, again, absorb that element, but absorb it in all truth. St. Ignatius of Antioch writes that this changing of days, or this highlighting of Christ rising on the day of the sun, highlights a very important truth about early Christianity, that Christians are those who no longer adhere to the Sabbath, but live according to the day of the Lord, on which our life ascended. Now, in the original Greek, or St. Ignatius wrote in Greek, this ascended is a word that would naturally be used to denote the rising of the sun. Now, Christ and the sun here are associated together, but with new imagery. Thus, the Christian would think that Christ rising under the figure of the rising sun, and his death is that of under sunset. But again, what the sun points to, S-U-N, the sun points to, is now fulfilled in the Son of God. The cosmic rhythms of death and life, and death and resurrection, death and rebirth, all these elements that are written into the natural world are written there because of the pattern of Christ from the beginning. From the earliest history of the liturgy, we can see that Sunday was the day of remembering and celebrating the death and resurrection of Christ. Yet the death and resurrection of Christ for early Christians, again from the beginning, were not understood as just an enacted myth. They were not, the death and resurrection was not just another mystery cult practice, but it was a historical fact. We see this from the earliest creeds of Christians. Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate, was buried, and was raised. So it's this idea that it's a historical document in a way. All those events in the primitive Apostles' Creed are historical, even if they have maybe a spiritual or mythological, so-called mythological element to them. You know, Christ was born, historical, lived, historical, died, historical, raised, historical event. Even his conception by the Virgin Mary. These are all kind of definite acts in history. You don't really hear much of kind of the poetic myth, the kind of mythological poetic elements of Christ's pre-existence, or he dwelt in a heavenly realm in this land that no one's ever heard of. I mean, he's not like the Olympian gods that dwell somewhere else, but these are all things that happened in history. So again, the historical fact of the resurrection is something that sharply marks Christians off from the mystery cults or the kind of other kind of, pagan myths, if you want to say. But nonetheless, as Christians and early Christians begin to dwell on the redeeming death and resurrection of Christ, it becomes natural to them to see this as Christ's death and resurrection as a divine fulfillment. It's a divine fulfillment of kind of those intimations, those prefigurements that had been preserved in the myths of their Greek and Roman neighbors. But this helped shape their conception of what happened in the death and resurrection of Christ. That throughout the New Testament and in Christ's death, you see elements again of light and darkness, that the sun was darkened at his resurrection or at his death. There's something more than a natural event here, but it was a profound and meaningful symbol that the darkness that their pagan neighbors talked about was being fulfilled here at the death of Christ. That the death of Christ is the true sunset, because Christ is the light of the world. So as the sun, Athanasius writes, as the sun returns from the west to the east, so the Lord arose out of the depths of Hades to the heavens of heavens. So all the mysteries of Christian faith are to be seen kind of in this sunscape. We can see the baptism of Jesus, the baptism of the faithful. The baptism of the faithful derive its power from this sunset of Christ, but then also his glorious rising on the third day. So Christ's descent into hell, into Hades, is this redemptive act. It's all, even embedded again in the earliest creeds. Nonetheless, there is no hint that the content, the essential belief of the resurrection, was in any sense derived from these myths. All that happened was that Christ borrowed symbols and images from the thought and fantasy of the world of antiquity. That the early Christians grew up in this world, and they preserved these images to serve their own precisely defined biblical and traditional faith. So if this implies anything, it implied a belief that the things which the pious pagans believed had a vague intimation of the coming of Christ, that Christ had become a higher order of reality that fulfilled pagan longing. The essential content of belief for Christians really comes from St. Paul's letters, especially the letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where St. Paul says, if Christ is not raised, then our faith is in vain. In fact, we are kind of the worst of people if we proclaim that Christ has been raised from the dead. So if the resurrection is taken away, if it never happened, then, as Pope Benedict says, we could still retain some very powerful and helpful ideas about God, the nature of man, man's being, man's obligations, and perhaps even a religious worldview. But the Christian faith itself would be dead. It's only if Jesus has really been raised has something new occurred and changes the world and the situation of mankind. So it's precisely that Christians then were able to kind of incorporate the cosmic world and the pagan world around them, was they believed that Christ had truly been raised, in fact, in history, that something new had occurred that does change the world and change the situation of mankind. Mankind is no longer subject to, as St. Paul says, the elements, the cosmic or primordial elements of the world, but rather Christianity can now firmly take revelation, be self-assured in the truth of divine revelation, and find where truth and goodness exist in any place in the world and incorporate it into its own. That they began to see that Christ was the pre-existent Logos that permeates the world, and that he proved this in his death and resurrection. Not just his death, not just his life, but principally, above all else, in this coming back from the dead. So there's a new meaning to the nature of light, the nature of darkness, of day and night, like I said, sun and moon, death and resurrection. Especially if you go to the Easter Vigil and you see the the baptisms of the faithful and the Exultet, you will hear these images and you will hear these symbols all throughout. The part of the reason why the liturgy begins kind of on the cusp of the sunset. One thing I really like about the Easter Vigil is it's one of the few vigils few masses in the liturgical year that still retain the kind of this primordial cosmic element. There's some masses in the old calendar. There's Ember Days and Rorate Days. There's the masses for harvest that still exist. There's the masses for the different changing of the seasons. And there's, of course, the Rorate Caeli Mass, which takes place during Advent, and it's usually done only with candles. And it's said at the very early hours of the morning, so it's dark. And as the priest lifts up the consecrated host, the sun is supposed to rise. So there's supposed to be this kind of rhythm between the Mass and the natural cycle or the cosmic cycle. Again, in the new Mass, in the new order, we have this Easter Vigil that still retains it. So it begins outside the church. And there's the candle, there's the fire. The priest talks about Christ being the same yesterday, today, and yesterday. Christ as the Alpha and the Omega. He makes the sign of the cross, and as he's making it on the candle, he's doing the four axis, the up, down, left, and right. Later, he'll take the Paschal candle and he'll dip it into the holy water font, sanctifying the waters as God did in the beginning. I'll probably do another episode on the different symbolism going on in the Easter Vigil, especially the Exultet and the baptisms. But the idea is that the faithful, especially those who are unbaptized and are about to be baptized, are entering into the church in this moment when Christ is in the underworld, that the sun is setting, that is, the Son of God is dying and going into the underworld to save those who have died before his coming. And the faithful are mimicking this action. They're going into the church as the sun sets. They're dying to their former selves. And while the world is still and while the world is dark, it kind of, again, mimicking the death of God's Son as Christ descends in the underworld in silence and dwells in the tomb in silence. So the faithful enter in when the rest of the world is kind of going to sleep. The faithful are in the church, and that's why they're baptized at night, that they symbolize the death of the old self, the uniting the death of their old self to the death of Christ. Now, usually the liturgy doesn't last so long that when you leave the church, the sun is rising. But the idea is that you are baptized in the night. Your old self dies, and in the next morning, when Christ rises from the tomb, you too have risen with him. So there's a nice, union of the spiritual and the mystical elements, or the spiritual and the natural elements. I have here some of the readings or some of the lines from the Exultet and the prayers outside of the church. So the priest cuts a vertical line and he says Christ yesterday and today. Then he cuts a horizontal line, the beginning and the end. Then he carves letters, which signify the Alpha and the Omega, and all time belongs to him in all ages. You also have, of course, the procession in, where the church is dark except for candles held by the faithful, the light of Christ. So again, you have the idea of light and darkness at play here. But going back to, I want to define this line from the Exultet, going back to the idea of the spiritual and the natural being united. In the Exultet, there's this line that says, "O truly blessed night, when the things of heaven are wed to those of earth, and divine to human." So when things of heaven are wed to those of earth, divine to human. So there's this idea in sacramental theology of the natural and the divine united together. You have the washing of water, the natural, but united to something sacred underneath the earth. In the essence of the sacrament, or the interior of the sacrament, is something spiritual and divine. That's, I think, a great summary of the entire Easter vigil and the Easter celebration. The things of heaven are wed to the things of earth, the divine to the human. That all throughout, again, the liturgy, all the cosmic elements of light and darkness, like I said, fire and night, and the sun and the moon, night and day, death and resurrection, all these elements are natural, but they're also divine. They're the things of heaven and the things of earth. And because Christ is both of those, this, I think, is central again to our understanding of symbolism and archetypes and all that, is that Christ is both God and man. So he unites all of the realms together in himself. And preeminently in the liturgy of Easter, that is made manifest. That Christ has, what is personified in Christ is this idea that the natural and the sacred, or the natural and the spiritual, can be united. That the natural reveals something about the sacred. The natural is not sacred in and of itself. These cosmic elements are not in and of themselves divine. But they point to the divine. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe another time, I said, delve into the symbolism a little bit more. There's, of course, the line about the truly necessary sin of Adam and the happy fall of Adam that merited a redeemer. It's a strange line, but I think it's a very, very packed line with a lot of meaning. So some other time I'll go through those, but for now I'll end it there. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can email me at basicallyrelatedpodcast@gmail.com, and also have a blessed Easter.